for New Jersey's urban and natural forests. I'm Marjorie Kaplan. I'm Associate Director of Rutgers Climate Institute, and along with my colleague Jean Herb of the Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, I co-direct the newly established New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. Other than today's presenters, Patricia Leopold and Professor Richard Lathrop and our Rutgers team, you are all muted, so to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen and a series of circles will be displayed. There's one circle that looks like a dialog bubble, and if you click that, the chat comes up and you can type your questions there. You're welcome to type your questions into the chat box throughout today's presentation. Please type into the all panelists box. We are monitoring the questions as they come in, and after the formal presentation, we'll address as many of your questions as time allows. We'll be recording today's webinar and we'll alert you to its availability. For those of you who haven't been on any of our previous webinars, I'd like to give you a quick overview about the newly formed Climate Change Resource Center for New Jersey. It's housed at Rutgers. It was created by legislation signed by Governor Murphy just this past January to create and support the use of impartial and actionable science to advance government, public, private, and non-governmental sector efforts to adapt to and mitigate a changing climate. It's intended to conduct applied research, create planning tools, develop technical guidance, undertake pilot projects, and provide practical support for addressing climate change here in New Jersey. The center also has as part of its mission to connect actionable research to policymakers, planners, practitioners, the media, communities, students, and other individuals through outreach, training, and education. So in keeping with our mission, we're very pleased to present today's webinar by Patricia Leopold and Professor Richard Lathrop. Patricia Leopold is the Climate Adaptation Specialist for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. In this role, she leads activities to build and strengthen partnerships, synthesize research into non-technical language for a variety of audiences, develop tools for forest managers, and promote the use of tools in adaptive forest management. She coordinates the Climate Change Response Framework, a collaborative project focused on integrating climate change considerations into on-the-ground planning and activities in the Central Appalachian and Mid-Atlantic regions. Our other speaker is Professor Richard Lathrop, who's from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers. Rick has served as director of the Walton Center for Remote Sensing and Spatial Analysis since 1999. He also co-leads the Sustainable Raritan River Initiative, and he's the inaugural holder of the Johnson Family Chair in Water Resources and Watershed Ecology. Before I turn it over to Patricia, just a quick reminder to put your questions in the chat to all panelists, and we will get to as many as possible during the Q&A session. And with that, it's my pleasure to invite Patricia Leopold to turn on her video and audio.
Hi, everybody. I have a little bit of a slow connection today, but hopefully it'll remain steady for the length of the talk. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And next I will share my screen. Okay, so hopefully that works for everybody. And can someone verify you can hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. All right, then. So thanks, everybody. I'm just one of a team of people working on adaptation and carbon management in our NIACS group. We call ourselves NIACS for short. We're the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. We're primarily supported through three branches of the Forest Service: the Northern Research Station, the Eastern Region, and Northeastern Area State and Private Forestry. And most of us are housed in either the Forest Service or Michigan TAC. I'm one of the Michigan TAC staff members in our group. And our steering committee also includes industry and academic collaboration to address scientific and management needs in the fields of climate and carbon. NIACS is a pretty unique organization, and sometimes people have trouble understanding how we're organized. So maybe this will help you. You can think of NIACS as being like a warehouse filled with people, capacity, skills, experience, and actual equipment, all related to making climate change science more accessible. We then use this warehouse to operate and supply different storefronts that provide this information to various audiences. And then we also run different websites and programs on behalf of other organizations like USDA Research and Development and the Northern Forest Climate Hubs. And one of these storefronts, if you will continue the analogy, is the Climate Change Response Framework, now in its 10th year and still growing. The framework is designed to specifically help land managers consider climate change in project-level plans, connecting the dots between broad adaptation concepts and on-the-ground actions. And there are 4 main components to the framework, and I'll cover each of them during this presentation. But each of these, the partnerships, the vulnerability assessments, the forest adaptation resources, and the adaptation demonstrations, they all work together to create a rationalized climate change response that your average forest manager can participate in. And partnerships have been critical as I've coordinated the work across the Mid-Atlantic region and other areas as well. The Forest Service initiated this framework based on the recognition that no one agency can work alone on climate change adaptation. And I have to agree that much of the work in this region could not have happened without participation by key partners, including Rutgers University, the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Allegheny National Forest, the Nature Conservancy, Penn State, and many others. These partners contributed to both the creation of the regional vulnerability assessments and also the revision of adaptation strategies. They are also critical in delivering these resources to different stakeholders and helping us at NIACS deliver technical assistance in using those resources. So a big thank you to all of our partners. And among other things, partnerships are crucial for understanding climate change and its expected effects on forest ecosystems. For each of the regions that we work in across the Midwest and Northeast, we have created forest ecosystem vulnerability assessments, and the newest one was published in 2018 for the whole Mid-Atlantic region, shown here in light blue. Each report covers a different geography and different partnerships and are geared toward natural resource professionals with little background in climate change science. These reports focus on tree species and forest ecosystem responses to past climate change, as well as a range of potential future climate changes. The reports also incorporate species distribution and process models like the Climate Change Tree Atlas and Landis Pro, and an expert panel of researchers and managers used a formal process to assess the vulnerability of major forest ecosystems in each region. An important limitation of these reports is that they provide a baseline of information on regional vulnerability, but stop short of providing recommendations or judgments on how to use this information. And the answer to that question is provided in the forest adaptation resources. And the Mid-Atlantic Vulnerability Assessment is also provided online as a story map, which contains many of the data sets and even newer versions of the data sets, which you can view or import into ArcGIS if you would like to analyze your own project area. So after we have a good understanding of the ways in which our forest ecosystems are vulnerable to climate, next we have to figure out what we do as forest managers about it. Among the many expected variables, forest managers have always had to plan for the unexpected, for insect pests outbreaks, drought, and flooding when it does rain. Climate change and related disturbances are incorporated into planning and management, just like many of these other threats. And admittedly, to the average forest planner, climate change could simply be another drop in the bucket. And the big question here is, what actions can help systems adapt to climate change and other threats while also meeting landowner needs? So our initial idea was to take all of the information known about climate change and then compile a list of recommendations that would fit nicely in a professional guidebook. And we could just hand it to you and say, hey, here are all the answers. But it turns out that nobody really likes being told what to do. And on top of that, the same answers just don't work for everybody. But if you really want to boil it down to a single answer for how to respond to climate change, I can give you this. It depends. It really, really depends on where you're working and what you're trying to achieve. Because each landowner is starting off with a unique set of site conditions and management goals and objectives, the adaptation solutions are going to be unique as well. And it's based on this philosophy that we've developed the forest adaptation resources available for download at the URL. And again, this is not a set of recommendations about how everyone should respond. It's more like a set of questions and a thought process that can lead to totally flexible, customized actions for climate adaptation. And it consists of two main parts: a menu of adaptation strategies and approaches for forest managers, and the adaptation workbook. And I'll describe both of those in a little more detail. The strategies and approaches are arranged in a hierarchy that allows you to decide what's most relevant for your particular situation. So it's kind of like ordering off a restaurant menu. You only select the combination of things that best suit your particular needs. And the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches was first developed for natural forest ecosystems across the Northeast and US. And we have those printed in the forest adaptation resources. But now we have also worked since then with a number of different partners to develop menus for a variety of disciplines that they were interested in and really demanded resources for. Each menu is organized from these broad adaptation strategies to more specific approaches that can be further refined into specific tactics or silvicultural prescriptions. So we give you the strategies and we give you the approaches, but then we ask you to define exactly how those strategies and approaches would be implemented in your project area. And those would be the tactics. So some of our other menu disciplines or topics include urban forests, forested watersheds, tribal perspectives, carbon management, fire-adapted ecosystems, agriculture, recreation, non-forested wetlands, and inland glacial lake fisheries. And then we also have partners that are working on menus for wildlife management and coastal ecosystems. So we're covering quite a few topics these days. And the menus really work hand in hand with the adaptation workbook, which in reality is a series of worksheets that lead a user through 5 steps. And in step 1, we define the goals and objectives, the forest conditions and the site characteristics. In step 2, the vulnerability assessments are used to identify relevant climate change trends for the area of interest. Step 3 identifies how those trends may make it easier or harder to achieve management goals and objectives, and it gives us the opportunity to adjust those expectations if need be. Then in step 4, the adaptation strategies and approaches are used to help tailor specific adaptation tactics that will address those challenges or opportunities and make it more likely that we can achieve our management goals and objectives. And then finally, in step 5, we identify ways in which we can track our progress toward meeting management goals and objectives after implementing those adaptation actions. And this process might look very familiar to you as another version of an adaptive management cycle. And one of the benefits of this adaptation version is putting the whole thought process together. Completing the process also provides valuable documentation for communicating the need for action to various stakeholders or funding mechanisms or leadership. And when used together, the adaptation workbook and the strategies and approaches work to help the user create that clear rationale for management actions by connecting them to those broader adaptation ideas. And they promote a logical train of thought, helping to connect the dots between our goals and objectives. And the menu helps us make our ideas more specific while connecting our climate change vulnerabilities and challenges to our response. So in the end, it's a very well-defined set of thoughts with clear actions that address climate change impacts. And the type of actions that are identified usually fall into several broad categories depending on the situation. So this chart roughly represents the actions that we most often see implemented in projects. Many of these adaptation actions might be things that you are doing anyway, but climate change just makes it more important to do those things because they address specific climate change impacts. A smaller proportion of actions will require small tweaks to what you're already doing, and these tweaks will result in an increased likelihood of success in meeting management goals and objectives. And some actions may be completely new and different than anything you've tried before, but are actions that are necessary and beneficial to address climate change over the lifetime of the project. And in the near term, adaptation may look most like the same management, but as the time frame of the project gets longer, adaptation is more likely to include those tweaks and new ideas. So what does this look like in terms of a real project? You can visit our website and you'll find numerous adaptation examples from a variety of state, federal, private, tribal, industry, and municipal ownerships across the Midwest and Northeast. These examples cover many different forest types, as well as a huge diversity in management goals and objectives, everything from providing wildlife habitat to timber production and others. Each one is totally different, but can serve to show you how climate change is being addressed on the ground. And the great thing is that you can sort through these examples if you're looking for a certain ownership or forest type, and you can zoom in on those. So today I'll show you one of these project level examples and hopefully give you a sense of how the project works and what kinds of information land managers have developed. So this example is from private land. It's called the Hudson Farm Club in the northern part of the state. And this project was undertaken by Gracie and Harrigan Consulting Foresters. And so the exact location of the private land project is kept private, but the project area covers about 3,000 acres on a client's property. Step one of the adaptation workbook is to define the area of interest, the management goals and objectives, and the time frame for the project. So in this case, the majority of the property here is forested upland of mostly mid-successional closed canopy forests. And due to a past combination of management, fire suppression, and natural succession, this forest type, they are seeing that it's shifting away from oak hickory and more toward a northern hardwood mesic moisture-loving forest type. In addition, deer populations have been managed on this property through a quality deer management program over the last 5 years. And recent management actions in the recent past included a modified seed tree harvest that retained 10 to 15 song tree trees per acre, and included invasive plant removal as well. And after 2 years, post-harvest regeneration surveys confirmed that, in fact, the regeneration was dominated by maple and birch trees. And interestingly, the yellow-breasted chat, a state species of concern, was observed using the young regeneration. And the current management goals and objectives then include broad goals to continue improving the overall quality, health, and vigor of the forest, and to also restore early successional habitat for the state endangered golden-winged warbler and other species that utilize that same niche. And the more specific management objectives included improving light conditions on the forest floor, reducing the seed source for northern hardwood species, and reducing mortality of oak during periods of drought, which are likely to become more frequent. Getting ahead of myself though, because step 2 is where we assess the climate change impacts and vulnerabilities for the project area. So the potential effects of future climate on forests in New Jersey in this project area in particular included warmer temperatures and drier soils in the summer months. There is also, by the Climate Change Tree Atlas, a projected decrease in suitable habitat for red maple, black birch, sugar maple, and American beech. And then there's potential increases in invasive plants, increased precipitation overall, but longer periods of no rain between these bigger storm events, and then an increased disturbance from wind and storms. And then in step 3, we identify management challenges and opportunities related to those impacts and vulnerabilities. And we evaluate whether our objectives are still feasible. And if not, there's an opportunity here to go back and change our management objectives. So for this project, a major challenge was identified in that regeneration and the long-term viability of northern hardwoods may be threatened by increases in temperature, seasonal soil moisture deficits, and more frequent drought conditions. However, there were also some opportunities that were identified. For example, the Climate Change Tree Atlas predicts increases or stability in suitable habitat for many of the oak and hickory species, and the projected declines in suitable habitat for those northern hardwood species could reduce competition with those oak and hickory species. And then another opportunity that they saw was that guiding regeneration now and helping to form the future forest now will increase the forest health and vigor over the long term if they are building in climate change modeling as part of their path forward. Step 4 then is to develop specific adaptation actions that address climate change related challenges and opportunities. And here is where the menu of adaptation strategies and approaches is used. So staff used the menu for forest ecosystems to identify the most relevant actions that could work for them. And then they developed even more specific tactics to show how those approaches and strategies could be implemented. And so a consulting forester from Gracie and Harrigan first identified the overall approach to managing this stand under changing conditions, which is to restore the oak and hickory component of this forest while simultaneously reducing the northern hardwood component. And then we can see that under strategy 1, he selected approach 1.5, which is to restore or maintain fire and fire adapted ecosystems. And in this case, the tactic would achieve this approach by mimicking fire using an intermediate approach, an intermediate treatment to reduce the maple beech component and stimulate regeneration by sprouting. And then other adaptation tactics were selected to address those challenges that were related to increased problems with forest pests and pathogens and invasive species. And then step 5, the last step, encourage staff to identify ways to track their progress toward meeting management goals and objectives. In this project, it will be important to track the number of oak and hickory acres regenerating successfully, as well as the number of gypsy moth egg casings per acre so that they can monitor forest health over the long term. They also plan on monitoring the presence of invasive species at years 1 and 3 post-harvest, and treatment will be conducted as needed. So they'll respond to what they're seeing. And if you'd like to read more about this example, because I've gone through it pretty quickly, please visit our website, and just when you can filter through the adaptation demonstration projects, just filter for projects in New Jersey, and you'll find this one pretty quickly. And so the same process can be used in urban environments with just a few modifications. And to address urban challenges, we've developed the Urban Forestry Climate Change Response Framework led by my colleague at NIACS, Leslie Brandt. And this 3-tiered approach begins with a regional assessment of vulnerability, and then it steps down to the municipal or park district, and finally the project level to develop adaptation strategies at a local scale. So our first step was to, again, get an idea of the key impacts of climate change for the region and which tree species may be vulnerable. And so I'll highlight one of the major differences here. To understand impacts that are related to native tree species, we can use the Climate Change Tree Atlas developed by Lewis Iverson at the Forest Service for those major tree species, common tree species on the landscape. And the Climate Change Tree Atlas is a really valuable resource for native species in their natural habitats. But we know that urban areas are filled with other types of trees, including non-native species used in cultivated settings, many different cultivars, and even invasive species like European buckthorn. So for these rare and non-native varieties, we can use the climate models to assess changes in plant hardiness zones, also developed by Lewis Iverson. Projected changes in hardiness zones can give us an idea of what species may be suitable for planting now and into the future. And these projections suggest that New Jersey may shift from primarily zones 6 and 7 now to primarily zones 8 and 9 by the end of the century. For plants that are limited to zone 6 or 7, this could mean negative impacts on growing conditions through the end of the century. And then the information from the regional assessment is useful, but what does that mean for local urban forest managers? To get at that question, we developed a process for assessing vulnerability of urban forests at a local scale. And the factors that municipal foresters are facing include a variety of impacts that are physical and biological, just like natural forests, but also anthropogenic because of their urban setting. And their adaptive capacity factors can include biological and social factors as well. And it's this human component that is different from the way in which we assess the vulnerability of natural forests. And then the final part of the framework is to incorporate information into projects and planning. And we have a number of examples on urban forestry projects that have used the workbook. And the one I'll highlight for you today is not too far away. It's in Virginia in Fairfax County. And this project participated in our online workbook training that we held over the winter. So I'll walk through how they went through the urban process. In step 1, managers define their goals and objectives, and Fairfax County's goals were to review and adapt their tree species planting list to identify and preserve the best remaining and intact forests for future management, to create best management practices for use of managing invasive species, and then to conduct targeted outreach to county residents in civilian identification and management of invasive species. And then in the second step, they identified their key climate change impacts. And so here they were really thinking about increases in temperature that are exacerbated by that urban heat island effect. They were also concerned about the larger amount of impervious surfaces like parking lots and sidewalks that would contribute to challenges in managing more heavy rain events. They were looking at longer growing seasons, and then it also, these changes perhaps being better for invasive species and some insect pests. And then in step 3, they identified their challenges and opportunities. So some of their challenges were soil compaction from those heavy rain events. Stressed trees would be more prone to pests and diseases, so maybe exacerbated again by that urban heat island effect. More resources would be needed for tree maintenance and establishment in those conditions. And then that extended growing season might favor invasive species. And then in terms of opportunities, they thought they might see a decreased threat from gypsy moth because wetter springs support an introduced biocontrol fungus and might help that control mechanism be more successful. An increase in a variety of southern tree species could be included in their planting list. And increases in temperature might increase public desire and support for planting shade trees. And then for step 4, a menu of adaptation strategies was created specifically for urban forests. And this menu contains 10 broad strategies and 35 more specific approaches for both your typical urban sites like street corridors and parks, as well as your more natural urban green spaces like forest preserves. And so this team of managers in Fairfax County identified some specific tactics to address their biggest impacts and challenges using that menu. And under their broad categories, for invasives, their staff and volunteers would be encouraged to participate in early detection and rapid response. For drought, they were considering adding organic soil amendments like mulch and biochar in order to help retain moisture. For heavy rain events, they were looking at restoring or reforesting riparian areas and proper buffer zone sizes. For pests and pathogens, they were looking at selecting resistant tree species and cultivars so that it was less likely that they would have a big proportion of trees die due to any one pest or pathogen. And then for warmer temperatures, they decided to encourage a variety of species from several different taxonomic levels and incorporate new species that are currently existing south of their area. And then step 5, if you remember, is to assess the effectiveness of their strategies and their progress toward meeting their management goals and objectives. And in this case, they will be monitoring existing percent tree canopy coverage, the number of development plans submitted to the county for review, the number of trees planted every year, the quantity of different species planted, and where those established invasive species are. So if you would like more information on the urban framework, please visit our website or feel free to reach out to Leslie Brandt directly. And I've also included a link to this project if you would like to read more about it. And we have over 250 examples of working with a variety of landowners to use the vulnerability assessments and the adaptation workbook together to address those relevant impacts and decide what actions to take. These examples are summarized online, and you can find them all at forestadaptation.org/demos. And we also have an online workbook where you can create a user login and save data that you can work on at different points in time, save your data, log off, log back on. And you can also use it to create a report at the click of a button. So the online work can be a little bit daunting, though, if you've never used our process before. So just contact us to find out how best we can support you as you dive into climate adaptation. Maybe we can work with you one-on-one. But we also hold online trainings and workshops to teach folks how to use our resources while actively making progress on their plans. So we teach while they're working on their projects. So these come in the form of one-on-one consultations. And because of COVID-19 safety, we've really stepped up our game on virtual workshops and full adaptation training courses, usually offered for free. So this year we did a course over the winter, spring, and we just finished a summer session. And we're currently planning several new courses for the winter, so please keep an eye out and contact us if you're interested in participating in those courses. They're usually 1 hour each week over the course of 6 weeks, and it gives you time to work on your project in between, consult your office mates and coworkers, and just generally tackle adaptation on your own time. So with that, I would love to take any questions, and I just encourage you to reach out if you're interested in any of these resources. I will be going on maternity leave soon, but if you go to forestadaptation.org and click on who we are, you can contact any number of our team that works on these adaptation frameworks, and they would be happy to help you out. Otherwise, I will be back in December and I'll work with you then.
Thank you, Patricia, for that great presentation. We are monitoring questions in the chat box, so we're going to do that at the end. So folks are continue to please keep an eye out. Go ahead and submit your questions. We're monitoring them. We'll curate them at the end. I'd like to now invite Professor Richard Lathrop to turn on his video and audio, and he'll make a presentation, and then we will move to the Q&A portion.
Okay. Hello, folks. Let me just get this set up from the beginning. And just confirmation that you can see my screen?
Yes, Rick.
Okay, we can hear you.
Great. So well over a decade ago, a group here at Rutgers began to develop a program of research and outreach related to climate adaptation. And so initially our focus was on coastal resiliency issues, but at the instigation of Brad Hillman, our Dean of Research, to think about, Dean of Research at New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, about 4 to 5 years ago, to think about, forest adaptation issues. And so we started as part of the broader rubric of our NJ Adapt platform, was start to thinking about a component of that focused on forests here in the state. So we call this NJ Forest Adapt, and part of the Rutgers team at the Center for Remote Sensing and Spatial Analysis, myself and Jim Trimble, and then Office of Research Analytics, Lucas Markson and Dan Farnsworth. Marjorie, you've met at the Climate Institute, and then at the Center for Resilient Landscapes, Jason Grabowski and Pam Zipsey. And then outside, you've already met Patricia, but a number of folks important at New Jersey Parks and Forestry, the Northeast Regional Climate Center up at Cornell University, and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as others. So when we were thinking about NJ Forest Adapt, our goal was to promote climate resilient forests across New Jersey and the broader Northeast region. And if you go back to one of Patricia's slides in terms of the adaptive management approach and thinking about number 2 there in terms of assessing basically the present state of the forests, as well as potential climate impacts. And so thinking about that, and we met with Patricia early on in this process, our goal was not to recreate that, but provide information to folks here in New Jersey about that particular step to be able to assess their forest resources and to be able to bring information, place-based information on the state of New Jersey's forests, thinking about forest type, status, threats, and risks. So that you could think about that. That's a key step in terms of then going into actually thinking about management approaches. And our goal here was to our objective to bring together mapped data from a diversity of existing credible and authoritative sources. There's a lot of information out there, and the idea was to be able to bring that together to make it easier for people here in state as well as in the region to access that information. And to provide links to other information resources. And so a number of the things that Patricia mentioned, you'll see later on, we have links to that. So as a way to access that information. What do you do with the information, in terms of the climate risks and thinking about adaptation strategies and case studies? And then for folks that want to go back to the digital sources, we have links there, as well as I'll talk about some of the synthesized kind of takeaway information that we have as part of our platform. Okay, so here are some of the themes. And so one of the first things that we did was to survey the community, and some of you may have been involved in that, find out what kind of decisions people are making related to forest resources, what kind of information do they use now, where do they get their information, what information would they like. And so based on that, that gave us a starting point, thinking about some of the different themes related to climate. But again, more broadly, what are some of the existing, how do you characterize the forest in your particular community or park, reserve, whatever, and then some of the risks out there. And so this is a web-based GIS system. And so in terms of the first theme, so what I'm going to do is give you a quick tour of what the capabilities are. And so that first theme is the climate map. And so this is working with the Northeast Climate Center. And so we have existing information. In this case, we're looking at growing degree days. And under the existing historical baseline as from 81 to 2000. So we using that as baseline. And then you could go in and look at under different climate scenarios, RCP 4.5 versus 8.5 are pretty commonly used. And then thinking about different time frames in terms of the future. And so then one of this might be what's the absolute growing degrees days or the change from baseline. So you might be more interested in that. How much is it going to change versus what I know today? So we've built that capability. And then on the left-hand side of the screen right now, you can see some of the different parameters that we have. And we're working on adding some additional climate parameters as well, metrics. Going to the next thing, climate-associated risk maps. And so this relates to specifically thinking about how is climate going to affect plants. And so this is in terms of heat zones. We also have other information in terms of freezing and the like. And then in terms of just showing you some of the capabilities, I'm showing the heat zones and then the little info button. And so it tells you a little bit about what it is and how to interpret that particular map. One thing, I don't know if you saw on the news last week, but this past July was the warmest July in New Jersey on record. Seven of the most warmest or the Julys have been since 2010. Okay, and so this is showing land surface temperature in the month of July, daytime surface temperature. So this you can see is pretty coarse, and so in many cases this is working with a NASA data set. Again, we're taking credible, authoritative resources, existing information sources. In this case, we felt we really needed to step it down. So we developed a novel data set using remotely sensed information so that you could actually get down to kind of the block level scale and looking at urban heat island effects across the state of New Jersey. Now, all of these, there's the capability that you can increase, decrease the opacity. So if you don't want to, if you want to see what's underneath it, you can change the opacity to see different kinds of maps, imagery, and then you have that kind of flexibility. Moving on down, thinking about forests from a carbon perspective. And so working with the USDA, the forest inventory assessment data, and they've developed carbon maps. And this is forest carbon total, but you might be interested in the different components of that. You can see we've included a county overlay. And again, this was based on work we got from other folks. Okay, and then okay, I gotta turn this one. Okay, I gotta turn off my phone. Siri is trying to contact me. Climate Change Atlas. Patricia mentioned this, and so this is looking at the current day. So looking at hemlock, and then looking at as it's moving northward under climate change scenarios, and then looking at the change. She mentioned that. So there's an example of a species moving north. You might be interested in a species that's going to be coming in, increasing. This is showing loblolly pine, and then under future scenarios. We also have information about county forest statistics maps, just some basic statistics at the county level. Thinking about land cover, this is just showing percent canopy cover across the state. And then you can see in terms of the broader region. So in many cases, we did not restrict it to New Jersey. If the data was regional, we kept it there. So you can look at adjoining states. There were specific data sets that were Jersey centric. So this is, for instance, our the 2012 land use land cover for the state of New Jersey, and just bringing out the forest types. Looking at the USDA has a number of different resources on different kinds of pests and diseases. And so this is pulling their information, in this case showing the emerald ash borer map. And then we have developed some customized data set. This is showing forest dieback zones due to sea level rise along the state of New Jersey. So in some cases, again, where this is an issue of concern has been identified by our stakeholders, we've tried to accommodate that. Okay, and then linking, that gives you just a brief overview of the maps. And then in the resources, we have links to a number of these different sources, including the NIACS Adaptation Workbook. We also include case studies. So the one Hudson Farm Club that, unfortunately, if you looked at Patricia's map, we have that one in terms of case study in the state right now, but maybe there's other ones that you're familiar with that we can incorporate. And then a link to the data resources out there. And then in terms of outputs, we've what we call municipal snapshots. So working with the state community, urban and community forestry, developing specific information extracted from all these data sets for particular every municipality within the state. So it's not all the data, but it's particular key metrics that people are interested in. And then finally, you can get different kinds of maps. Of course, someone's knocking at the door. And then this is giving our New Jersey forest its continually evolving process. And here's the website. And I'm going to turn on my that's the end of my show, and I'm going to turn off my mic. Okay, hand it back over to you, Matt.
Okay, Rick, great job. Sorry about that, folks. This is what we're all dealing with COVID, but we're doing. Rick, you did a great job. Thank you, and thank you to Patricia for your wonderful presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some time to get to questions that folks have been typing into the chat box. So I'd like to invite both our speakers to turn on their videos and audios, and hopefully things will have calmed down at Rick's house. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carrie Ferraro, who's also part of our team, who's been diligently monitoring the chat, and she will direct your questions to our speakers. So.
Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you so much to you, Patricia and Rick. So we had a number of questions, including a few questions about incentives for participating in some of the programs that you both mentioned. For example, what was the incentive for the Hudson Farm Club And who paid for the work? Was it through any sort of Forest Service program? How did this all start?
I'm not the expert on how they decided to participate in the framework project. Gracie and Harrigan Consulting Foresters work with private landowners and essentially took it upon themselves to learn more about how to incorporate climate change into the way that they can help landowners. And so usually when we do an adaptation project with somebody, we help them use the workbook, and we provide different support and resources as they go along. And the amazing thing about Gracie and Harrigan was that they told us after the fact that they had done this work. And so I think that they just happened to be an innovative agency that saw the benefit of being able to answer the questions that were coming more frequently from their clients about climate change adaptation. So I think they were responding to a need that they saw in their client base. And that's generally who we most often work with on the landscape, are those folks whose incentive it is to respond to climate change because their stakeholders are looking for answers. And whether that's, a national forest or a state forest, stakeholders, and even private landowners, we're getting those questions a lot more frequently.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Jean Fox had a question. You had talked a little bit about private landowners, but for both you and Rick, about how local or how specific some of these recommendations can get. So, are there tips on what individual homeowners can do?
Do you want to address that, Patricia? I'll say from the data perspective, some of these data sets are, statewide. It can get down to the block level, but not down to the individual household level. And, especially when you're looking at some of these climate change scenarios, they're comparatively coarse. They give us a bigger picture.
Right. And there's really no data that's going to get you down to the level of your backyard. And so the vulnerability assessments that are available and all of the data resources like New Jersey Forest Adapt are going to be at a coarser resolution than, we might all be comfortable with. And so that's why when our group works with private landowners and even state and federal landowners, we look at a range of projected future climates. And we kind of look at the worst case scenario and we look at the best case scenario, and we encourage our forest managers to consider that the future climate might lie anywhere in between. And we just have to build that uncertainty into the decisions that we're making over the course of our projects. And so for smaller private landowners, we've helped them out in a couple of different ways. For really savvy landowners who are engaged with their forest management plans or their forest stewardship plans, who are very knowledgeable about what's on their property and what they're managing for, we can help them go through this process one-on-one. For other landowners, we've developed different resources. There's a Maryland landowner guide that I don't have the link for handy right now, but it was developed by the Pinchot Institute and I believe the Maryland Forest Service. And it basically highlights some of those regional climate change impacts and then gives you these broad categories of actions that landowners can do. And we've developed different outreach products in that way to help private landowners. But it really helps if they do have a good understanding of their forest sites and what they're trying to do there.
Thank you both. So the question came in as to whether you can speak to the tension between logging management of intact forests and ecosystem services, as related to carbon storage and watershed management or water quality benefits.
Rick, did you want to tackle that?
That's a big question, in terms of hitting a lot of different aspects. So I think it fits into some of the broader management objectives for particular properties or particular ownerships, and they may have different perspectives. Still with the idea that you're going to try to maintain, watershed integrity and the like. But I would think in terms of the Hudson Farm Club, they had, particular desires in terms of the forest types and related to their broader management objectives and forest uses. And so that's why they were taking one particular approach in terms of the harvesting or management activities.
And I can tell you that as far as industry foresters go, they're not completely out of the game on climate change adaptation. They are looking for ways to incorporate climate change into the work that they do as well, with the understanding that in order to supply continuous timber products, they really need to be maybe actively managing what they leave behind in a way that may not have happened in the past. And there's other examples of how to incorporate climate change into industry practices. And then, just for any landowner, the way that they're thinking about their land and their management objectives. Climate change is something that is going to affect all components of ecosystem services. And so whoever is managing the landscape would benefit from thinking about these resources and trying to think long-term about how what they manage for and what they do now will likely affect their ability to manage and do things later.
And I think some of the resources that, like, for instance, some of the planning lists and the like, if you're thinking about afforesting areas for carbon sequestration, you really want to think proactively, what palette of species do you want to use, plant now, and with the idea that it's in 100 years that you're really going to gain the full benefit. And so I'm thinking into the future in terms of your planning decisions today.
I think we could talk for another hour or two at least, just to address that question.
Perhaps we'll have to have another webinar. So I think we have time for one last question. And this question is about kind of the application of all this information and these tools that you're providing. Jay Watson asked whether you think we'll get to a point where we can use mapping and data to strategically target lands for preservation with the highest sequestration adaptation values.
If you look at the data, some of the data sets that we do have, you can see that there's a big difference in, across the state in terms of the overall biomass for some of the different, forest types. And so some of them do have potential to store greater amounts of carbon than other based on their geography and soils and terrain and the like.
And there's some really cool work being done by Mark Anderson in the Nature Conservancy about connecting resilient landscapes. And so that information doesn't build in climate change projections directly, but it identifies the places on the landscape where biodiversity is high because of the underlying geography and physiology of that region. And so that can help you target where on the landscape you might get the biggest bang for your buck. And then once you identify where there's places places are, you can use other data sets and adaptation resources to figure out how to manage for different species and habitat types in those areas. So you can really combine a lot of these resources to answer numerous types of questions about, how you really want to tackle a problem.
Well, on behalf of all of us here at the New Jersey Climate Change Research Center, we really like to thank Patricia and Rick for their wonderful talks and their information. We also want to thank all of you for your questions. Even though we couldn't get to all of them, it may not be evident to you, but we are taking them all into account. Some of you have asked us some questions we'll get back to you on. Others, we will start to, part of the initiative for this research center is to be able to hear from our constituents and see what are issues of concern to them and ways in which we can use them. Yes to Jessica's question about are we working with the state? Yes, we are providing this information to the state forestry folks, and we have been developing it in working with them in terms of the mapping tools. So we hear what you're saying, and we thank you all for your feedback. You can find us on the web at njclimateresourcecenter.rutgers.edu. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar in this series. It'll be tomorrow, August 18th at noon. Kate Spitaleri of Georgetown Climate Center will speak on their new Managed Retreat Toolkit. We will be sending you out a link to the recording of today's webinar as well when it's ready. So thanks again, and that ends today's session.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.